My name is Victor. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in systems, quiet ones, the kind that hums in the background, only noticed when they fail. I've been a data analyst, a security liaison, sometimes just the reliable one who spots issues early and fixes them before anyone else has to think about them. People usually describe me as calm, low maintenance, not dramatic. In meetings, I'm often the person whose comments get summarized by someone louder 5 minutes later. I don't interrupt. I don't sell myself aggressively. And because of that, I'm often underestimated. Not in a cruel way, but in a convenient one. The kind where people assume I'll absorb pressure, smooth things over, and stay loyal to the system even when the system stops being loyal to me. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about exposing villains or celebrating anyone's downfall. It's about something quieter and, I think, more familiar to many of us. It's about being asked to carry responsibility for a failure that you tried to prevent. About watching accountability drift away from those with power and settle, gently but firmly, on the person least likely to fight back. The moment everything changed can be summed up in one sentence I never thought I'd say out loud. I was asked to take the fall for a data breach I warned them about. That warning wasn't vague, it wasn't emotional, it was written, documented, and sent through the proper channels. In fact, the warning email was timestamped 6 months before the incident. At the time, it was acknowledged, filed, and quietly ignored. When the breach finally happened, the narrative shifted faster than I expected, and somehow I was standing at the center of it. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through how that happened. Not with outrage, not with dramatic confrontations, but with clarity. You'll hear how small dismissals compound, how silence gets misread as consent, and how preparation doesn't always look like action until it does. This is a story about emotional justice, not public justice, about choosing restraint over action and documentation over arguments. I'm telling this now because I promised myself I would tell it honestly. No exaggeration, no character assassination. Just the sequence of events, the internal shifts, and the decisions that couldn't be undone once they were made. If you've ever felt invisible in a system that relies on you, or quietly blamed for cracks you tried to seal, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever noticed the moment when staying quiet stopped being a virtue and started becoming a risk? For a long time, I knew exactly who I was to them. Not officially, of course. On paper, I had a title that sounded solid enough. Senior data analyst, security liaison, and sometimes subject matter expert when someone needed a slide to look credible. But inside the organization, my real role was simpler and unspoken. I was the safe one, the person you could rely on to notice problems early. The person who would flag risks without causing discomfort. The one who didn't escalate unless absolutely necessary, and even then did it politely, with bullet points and hedged language. I was useful because I didn't threaten anyone's authority. I didn't challenge ownership. I didn't demand visibility. And because of that, I slowly became invisible. In meetings, my presence was expected, but not centered. If I spoke early, the room was still settling. If I spoke later, the decision had already been shaped. People would nod, say good point, and move on. Sometimes my exact words would resurface later, reframed by someone else with more confidence or a louder voice. No one did this maliciously. It was just efficient, and I let it happen. I was seen as competent, not influential, reliable, not decisive. That distinction matters more than people realize. When something went right, it was the team. When something almost went wrong, but didn't, that was just good process. My contributions lived in the space between disaster and recognition, where prevention doesn't leave a visible footprint. If a system didn't fail, no one asked why. If a risk didn't materialize, it was forgotten. I told myself that was fine. I didn't need credit. I didn't want conflict. I believed that consistency would eventually earn trust in the ways that mattered. What I didn't realize was that trust without authority turns into expectation. An expectation without protection turns into liability. People came to me when they wanted reassurance. Can you sanity check this? Does this look okay from a security standpoint? Just make sure there are no red flags. I would review, respond carefully, and document my findings. Often my answers were cautious, conditional. I wasn't there to block progress, just to make sure the path was visible. But visibility can be inconvenient. So my concerns were often reframed as hypotheticals, edge cases, unlikely scenarios. I learned to hear phrases like, we'll circle back, or, that's a future state problem, or my favorite, let's not over-engineer this. Each time I nodded. Each time I adjusted my expectations a little lower. I became the person who absorbed ambiguity so others could move faster. And to be clear, I wasn't powerless. I had access. I had knowledge. I had history with the systems, years of context that lived mostly in my head and in carefully archived emails. But none of that translated into visible authority. I wasn't the final decision maker. I wasn't the one quoted in postmortems. I wasn't invited when the strategy was discussed at the highest level. I was invited when something needed to be checked quietly. Over time, that shapes how people treat you. Not with disrespect, exactly, but with assumptions. That you'll be flexible. That you'll understand constraints. That you won't push too hard. That if something goes wrong, you'll help clean it up. And I believed that about myself too. I told myself that staying calm was maturity. Not insisting was professionalism. That being agreeable kept the system running smoothly. I didn't see myself as invisible. I saw myself as essential but understated. Looking back now, I can see the difference. Essential people are protected. Understated people are convenient. At that stage, I still believed the organization valued integrity. Those warnings, once given, carried weight, even if they weren't acted on immediately. I believed that documentation mattered because fairness mattered, that accountability would naturally align with decision-making when the time came. I didn't yet understand that narratives are shaped after events, not before them. And I didn't yet realize that the role I had accepted, quiet, reliable, unseen, was already writing my part in that future story. I was useful, I was trusted, I was invisible. And for a long time, I thought those three things could coexist without consequence. The first time it happened, it was so minor, I almost missed it. There was a review meeting, one of many, about a new data integration pipeline. Nothing flashy, just another system being connected to another system because speed mattered more than elegance. I had gone through the documentation the night before, line by line, the way I always did. Most of it was fine, one section wasn't. It wasn't catastrophic, that was the problem. The issue sat in a quiet corner of the architecture, an authentication handoff that relied on assumptions instead of enforcement. If everything behaved perfectly, nothing would break. But if something didn't, if credentials were reused or logs weren't monitored as closely as promised, then the exposure wouldn't be loud. It would be patient. I flagged it, not dramatically, not with red text or exclamation points, just a note in the shared doc, followed by a short email. This isn't blocking, but it introduces a risk window we should be aware of. Happy to walk through options. During the meeting, I brought it up again, calmly, briefly. I even framed it as a question. The way I'd learned was safest. The room went quiet for a second. Then someone senior said, "Right, but that's pretty edge case, isn't it?" Another person nodded. Someone else checked the time. No one said I was wrong. No one argued. The concern just floated there for a moment and then drifted away as the conversation moved on to timelines and deliverables. The decision was made without formally addressing it. I remember thinking, okay, they've heard it, it's documented, that's enough. Except something subtle changed after that. In the follow-up summary, the risk wasn't mentioned, not even as a deferred item. The document was clean, approved, final. I hesitated before replying to the thread. I considered pushing back, just a line maybe, asking that the concern be captured somewhere official. But I didn't want to seem obstructive. I didn't want to be the person who slowed things down over something that might never happen. So I let it go. That was the first small cut. No blood, no pain, just a quiet realization that my input could be acknowledged verbally and erased in writing. That what mattered wasn't what was said in the room, but what survived in the record. After that, similar moments started to appear. A comment I made was paraphrased into something softer. A risk I outlined that was labeled low priority without discussion. A suggestion that was accepted only after someone else restated it more confidently. Each time I told myself it wasn't personal. And maybe it wasn't. But patterns don't need intent to be dangerous. What stayed with me most wasn't the dismissal, it was the ease of it. How quickly the group normalized, moving past my concern. How comfortable everyone was with ambiguity once someone else had decided it was acceptable. I started saving things more carefully after that. Not obsessively, just deliberately. Copies of meeting notes, versions of documents before and after reviews, emails where concerns were raised and responses were vague. I didn't think of it as protection at the time. It felt more like self-respect, like saying to myself, I'm not imagining this. Still, I stayed quiet. I continued to show up prepared, continued to offer measured input, continued to believe that consistency would eventually correct the imbalance. But that first small cut changed how I listened. I began to notice which risks were taken seriously and which ones were only tolerated as long as they didn't interfere with momentum. And I began to understand something uncomfortable. Being heard is not the same as being accounted for. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't escalate. I didn't demand changes. I just started paying closer attention. Because once you notice the first small cut, you start seeing where the blade keeps returning. After a while, the dismissals stopped feeling like events and started feeling like weather. They weren't dramatic. They didn't come with raised voices or sharp words. They arrived as patterns. Predictable, almost polite. My concerns were noted. My recommendations were appreciated. And the decisions, more often than not, went in the opposite direction. At first, I still reacted internally, a tightening in my chest when a risk was waved away, a quiet frustration when someone else took credit for a point I'd made weeks earlier. But repetition has a numbing effect. You adapt. You tell yourself stories that make it easier to stay. They're under pressure. They have more context than I do. This isn't the hill to die on. I became very good at rationalizing my own silence. There was always a reason not to push. A deadline, a client is waiting, a launch already announced, and I understood those pressures. I really did. I wasn't naive about how organizations work. Trade-offs are real. Perfect security doesn't exist. You choose which risks you can live with. The problem was that I wasn't part of the choosing anymore. I was there to identify risk, not to decide whether it mattered. So I adjusted. I softened my language even more. I added disclaimers. I framed warnings as hypotheticals layered with optimism. I learned which executives were more receptive and which ones would shut down if the word breach appeared too early in a sentence. I stopped bringing things up in large meetings and moved them to side conversations, hoping nuance would survive better there. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. What stayed consistent was the outcome. Forward motion without formal acknowledgement of the risk. And slowly something shifted inside me. Not anger, fatigue. The kind that comes from caring more than you're allowed to act on. From holding responsibility without authority. From knowing the shape of a future problem and being told implicitly that it was acceptable collateral. I told myself I was being professional. That choosing when to speak was part of maturity, that not every warning needed to become a standoff. But there's a fine line between restraint and erasure. I started noticing how often my role was described in diminutive terms. Victor will take a quick look. Victor can sanity check it. Victor's good at catching details, compliments technically, but always about support, never about ownership. No one asked me to sign off. No one asked me to block a launch. My value was in catching things early enough that someone else could decide whether to care. And when they didn't, the responsibility still lingered with me. Because I knew. Because I'd seen it. Because if something went wrong, I would remember that I'd noticed the crack before it widened. That awareness creates a quiet kind of stress. You start replaying decisions in advance, imagining post-mortems that haven't happened yet, wondering how much documentation is enough to protect yourself from future reinterpretations. Still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed intent mattered, because no one was being openly cruel, because the system rewarded speed and confidence, not caution, and because I didn't want it to become cynical. I thought endurance was integrity. What I didn't fully see yet was how normalization works, how repeated dismissal teaches people what they can get away with, how silence, even principled silence, can be read as agreement over time. By then, the small cuts had formed a pattern, and patterns, once established, don't need constant reinforcement. They run on expectation. I had become the person whose warnings were optional, and without realizing it, I had helped make them so. It wasn't announced. No one sat me down and explained it. But at some point, I understood the role I'd been assigned. I was the safety net, not the decision maker, not the owner, the one underneath everything, there to catch the consequences if they fell too fast or too hard. My job, as it had quietly evolved, was to make sure things didn't completely break, and if they did, to help explain why in a way that protected the larger structure. I was reliable, useful, invisible. Once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. It showed up in how tasks were delegated. I was looped in late, after strategic decisions were already made, with requests phrased as favors. Can you just review this quickly? We're already committed, but can you make sure it's okay? The assumption was baked in, the direction wouldn't change. My role was to reduce friction, not alter course. And I complied, because saying no would have required authority I didn't have. Because pushing back would have labeled me difficult. Because I still believed that being dependable was a form of influence, even if it was slow. I was trusted with responsibility, but not with power. That imbalance is subtle and dangerous. It meant I was accountable for outcomes I couldn't control. If something worked, it validated the decision makers. If something failed, it raised questions about execution, oversight, and communication, areas that lived suspiciously close to my domain. I started to notice how often people use my presence as reassurance. Victors looked at it as if my involvement alone reduced risk, regardless of whether my recommendations were followed. My name became a kind of shield, invoked after the fact to suggest due diligence. At first, that felt like respect. Then it started to feel like exposure, because I knew what wasn't being said. I knew which warnings had been softened, which concerns had been deferred, which trade-offs had been made without my agreement. And yet my quiet participation allowed a narrative to form, that I had endorsed the outcome. That's the thing about silence, it's easy to borrow. I considered pushing for clearer boundaries, asking for formal sign-off authority, requesting that unresolved risks be explicitly documented before launches. These weren't radical demands, they were standard in many organizations. But timing matters, and by then the pattern was established. Asking for that kind of clarity would have disrupted expectations, it would have forced conversations people weren't ready to have. So I stayed within the role I'd been given. I told myself that influence doesn't always look like control, that my job was to inform, not to decide. If leadership chose to accept risk, that was their responsibility. And intellectually, I still believe that's true. But emotionally, something else was happening. I felt a growing dissonance between what I knew and what I was allowed to act on, between my internal sense of accountability and the external limits placed on my voice. I began to prepare, not consciously at first. I became more precise in my language, more careful about timestamps, more deliberate about follow-ups that summarized conversations in writing, not to threaten anyone, not to build a case, just to be accurate, because accuracy is the only thing that survives reinterpretation. I didn't know then that this role, the one I'd quietly accepted, was setting the stage for something much larger. I still believed that if a serious incident ever occurred, the organization would look honestly at the record. That intent, context, and documentation would matter. I believed the system would protect those who tried to protect it. That belief hadn't broken yet, but it was starting to crack. The day something shifted didn't come with an argument. There was no raised voice, no sharp email, no moment I could point to and say that's when it changed. It was quieter than that, almost ordinary. I was sitting at my desk early, before most of the office logged on. The building was still. No notifications, no calendar reminders firing yet. Just the soft hum of the system coming online, one by one. I was reviewing logs from a routine audit, something I'd done dozens of times before. My attention wasn't urgent. My mind wasn't braced for discovery. I was just present. And then I saw it. Not a breach. Not yet. But a pattern that shouldn't have been there. Access is behaving exactly the way I had described months earlier. Not failing, just stretching. Operating within the letter of the configuration, but outside its spirit. It was subtle enough that no automated alert would have flagged it. Subtle enough that if you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it completely. But I was looking, because I remembered. I pulled up the old email, the one I'd sent 6 months earlier. The wording was careful, measured, almost apologetic. This isn't urgent, but this could become an issue if... Happy to discuss alternatives. The timestamp was there, clear, unambiguous. In that quiet moment, something inside me settled. Not fear, not anger, clarity. For the first time, I understood the full shape of the risk, not just technically, but narratively. I saw how easily this could be explained away later. How could one say the behavior was unexpected? How could claim no one had raised concerns? How the absence of action would be reframed as the absence of a warning. And I realized something else, just as calmly. If this ever became a real incident, the story would not automatically align with the truth. Truth requires structure. It needs records, context, sequence. Without those, it becomes negotiable. I didn't escalate immediately. I didn't send an alarmist message. I documented what I saw carefully and added it to my private notes. I cross-referenced the configuration history. I took screenshots. I saved logs. Not because something had happened, but because something eventually would. And then I went on with my day. Meetings, messages, small talk. I nodded in the right places. I answered questions. I played my role. No one noticed any difference. And that was the point. Internally, though, the shift was complete. I stopped assuming that good faith would protect me. I stopped believing that being right was enough. I stopped expecting the system to remember what I remembered. From that day on, and silence wasn't just a restraint, it was a choice. I would still warn them, I would still document risks, but I would no longer rely on memory or goodwill or verbal acknowledgement. I would rely on evidence. That morning didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable, like noticing the current in a river you've been standing in for years. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw. I simply adjusted my understanding of where responsibility actually landed and where it didn't. And once you see that clearly, you can't pretend you don't. After that morning, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, a pause to avoid friction, a way of staying agreeable. Now it was deliberate, measured, purposeful. I still spoke up, but only in ways that would survive later scrutiny. Every concern I raised was written. Every meeting summary included my exact language, not paraphrases. When someone responded verbally, I followed up with a calm recap, just to confirm my understanding, not accusatory, not defensive, precise. People didn't notice the shift because, on the surface, nothing looked different. I was still calm, still cooperative, still helpful, but the internal calculation had changed. I no longer tried to convince anyone. That was the key difference. Convincing requires energy. It requires emotional investment in the outcome. And I'd learned that outcomes weren't mine to control. What I could control was the record. So I focused on that. When risks were dismissed, I acknowledged the decision in writing. When timelines overrode caution, I noted the trade-off without commentary. When someone said, "We'll accept the risk," I made sure the sentence existed somewhere other than the air between us. This wasn't passive-aggressive. It wasn't a trap. It was alignment. If accountability was going to exist, it needed a trail. Others mistook my restraint for compliance, for agreement, for loyalty to momentum. They saw someone who wasn't pushing back and assumed I was comfortable with the direction. In truth, I was simply no longer trying to be persuasive. There's a freedom in that. Without the burden of needing to be heard, I could observe more clearly. I noticed who consistently deferred responsibility upward and who quietly let it slide downward. I noticed how often urgency was used as a substitute for justification, how quickly temporary exceptions became permanent architecture. And I noticed how often my presence was still used as reassurance. Victor's across it. He's seen the risks. If there were a real issue, she'd flag it. Those statements floated through conversations I wasn't always in. I'd hear them secondhand, casually as if they were facts. And in a narrow sense, they were true. I had flagged the risks. I was across it. What they didn't say was whether anyone had acted. I didn't correct the assumption. Not because it was fair, but because correcting it verbally wouldn't have changed anything. It would have created discomfort without altering behavior. So I let the assumption stand. Instead, I made sure the truth existed somewhere immutable. Emails, tickets, change logs, audit trails, dates, times. Language that was calm enough to be ignored in the moment, but clear enough to be undeniable later. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I wasn't planning exposure. I was preparing for accuracy. There's a difference. Accuracy doesn't shout, it waits. And while everyone else mistook my silence for softness, I was quietly repositioning myself outside the narrative they were unconsciously writing. I didn't need to challenge it yet. I just needed to make sure it couldn't swallow me when the time came. What they never noticed was how much work could happen without making a sound. From the outside, my days looked the same. Same meetings, same calm demeanor, same neutral language. I didn't suddenly become distant or secretive. I didn't close doors or lower my voice when people walked by. There was nothing to notice. But underneath that consistency, something else was taking shape. Slowly, methodically. I began to map the system the way you map a city you've lived in for years. Not just the main roads, but the alleys, the shortcuts people take when no one is watching. The places where responsibility quietly changes hands. I reviewed old incidents, not just the technical details, but the narratives that followed, who was named, who was protected, who absorbed blame without ever being explicitly accused. Patterns emerged there too. I noticed how often outcomes were framed as unforeseeable, how frequently language like unexpected behavior appeared, even when similar concerns had been raised before. I noticed how memory softened over time, how urgency rewrote history. So I stopped relying on memory altogether. I organized everything, not in one dramatic folder, but across systems that already existed. Version control histories, ticketing systems, archived emails, meeting notes with dates and participants clearly listed. I didn't add commentary. I didn't editorialize. I let the facts speak in their own quiet, unarguable way. I also learned, not because I lacked knowledge, but because depth creates options. I deepened my understanding of regulatory language, incident response frameworks, legal definitions around negligence versus accepted risk. Not to weaponize them, but to understand where lines were actually drawn. When people spoke casually about acceptable risk, I knew exactly what that phrase did and didn't protect them from. And still, I said very little. People assume preparation looks tense, defensive, obvious. They expect someone building leverage to behave differently, to pull away, to harden, to become visibly cautious. I did none of that. I smiled when appropriate. I joked lightly in meetings. I answered questions promptly. I stayed helpful. The more ordinary I seemed, the less anyone thought to question my internal shift. That's the thing about quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself. I also paid attention to timing. When concerns were raised, when decisions were made, when follow-ups were delayed just long enough to miss a checkpoint, none of it was illegal. None of it was outrageous, but it was consistent. And consistency tells a story long before an incident ever does. By then, the original risk I'd flagged was still unresolved. Not forgotten, just unprioritized. It lived in that gray space organizations create when acknowledging something feels safer than fixing it. I sent one more message. Calm. Clear. Non-urgent in tone, but precise in content. I referenced the earlier email, restated the potential exposure, asked if there was appetite to revisit mitigation. The response was polite, appreciative, non-committal. And that was enough, because now the timeline was complete. What they never noticed was that I was preparing. It was that I had stopped needing them to change course. I wasn't waiting for validation anymore. I wasn't hoping for alignment. I was simply making sure that when the story eventually got told by auditors, by leadership, by people far removed from the original decisions, it would be told in the right order, quietly, accurately, without my emotions needing to be involved at all. The private reveal didn't come as a shock. That's what surprised me most. When the incident finally surfaced, not publicly yet, not in headlines or emergency meetings, it arrived exactly the way I'd seen it in fragments months earlier. Quiet indicators, anomalies that on their own could be explained away. But together, they formed a shape I already recognized. I was alone when I confirmed it. No alert storm, no dramatic escalation, just a sequence of access logs lining up too cleanly to be a coincidence. The system hadn't been smashed into. It had been walked through, patiently, repeatedly, using the same assumptions I'd warned about. I didn't feel panic. I felt confirmation. I pulled up my notes, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted to be exact. Dates, times, configuration changes, the original warning email, the follow-up messages, the non-decisions. Everything sat there, already organized, already waiting. That's when the full leverage revealed itself. Not power, not exposure. Leverage is quieter than that. Leverage is knowing that the truth doesn't require embellishment to be devastatingly clear. I could see in a single timeline how responsibility actually flowed. Who had the authority to act? Who chose not to? Who benefited from the delay? And who historically would be the easiest to position as close enough to the problem to absorb the impact? Me. The realization wasn't emotional. It was structural. If this became a formal incident, and it would, the organization would need a clean story. One that emphasized complexity, shared ownership, and lessons learned. And within that story, there would be a subtle but critical question. Where was security oversight? I was the answer they would reach for. Not maliciously, not even consciously, just conveniently, because I was there, because I knew, because I'd been involved, because I hadn't stopped it. That's how accountability drifts. In that moment, I understood the difference between being blameless and being defenseless. I had assumed they were the same. They're not. I didn't celebrate this realization. I didn't feel vindicated. There was no sense of triumph, just a calm awareness that the path forward had narrowed. I now had something irrefutable, a complete, time-stamped record that showed foresight without authority, warning without control, involvement without decision-making power. And that meant I had a choice. I could stay exactly where I was, trusting that fairness would emerge on its own. Or I could step slightly outside the role I'd been assigned, without confrontation, without drama, and make sure the truth had somewhere solid to stand. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, not planning revenge, not rehearsing conversations, just accepting that this was no longer about being right. It was about not being erased. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded over several quiet hours, the way serious choices often do. Not as a dramatic fork in the road, but as a gradual narrowing of options until only one remained that I could live with. I listed them out mentally. I could escalate loudly, send urgent messages, force the issue into visibility immediately. That would protect the system, maybe, but it would also allow the narrative to form around urgency and reaction, not history. It would frame the incident as sudden, not foreseeable. I could stay silent and hope for fairness, let the process play out, trust that when questions were asked, the documentation would surface organically, that someone else would connect the dots. Or I could act in a way that didn't interrupt the process, but anchored it. That was the option that kept returning. Anchoring doesn't mean controlling. It means placing something solid in the current so it can't be swept away later. I decided to secure the record, not by leaking, not by threatening, by doing something entirely within policy, entirely unremarkable on the surface. I ensured that the documentation lived where it was supposed to live, I updated the official risk register, attached the original warning email, linked the follow-up notes, added the newly observed indicators, clearly labeled as preliminary, not conclusions. I referenced dates. I avoided speculation. Everything I added was factual, boring even, and irreversible. Once it existed in that system, it couldn't be quietly removed without leaving its own trail. It couldn't be reframed without acknowledging its presence. It couldn't be forgotten. I didn't announce what I'd done. I didn't send a message saying, just so you know. I let it sit. Because if someone noticed it quickly, that told me something. And if they didn't, that told me something else. This was the moment where I stepped out of invisibility. Not by speaking louder, but by placing weight where it mattered. I knew this choice changed things. From this point on, I couldn't unknow what I knew. I couldn't pretend that goodwill would automatically align with truth. I couldn't go back to being just the safety net. Whatever happened next, I had ensured one thing. When accountability was discussed, it would have to pass through facts that already existed. I didn't feel relief, I felt steadiness. The kind that comes when you stop negotiating with your own instincts. I closed my notes. I went back to my day. I answered messages. I attended meetings. I didn't hint at anything. But internally, I understood this was the irreversible step. Not because it would cause consequences, but because it removed my ability to be quietly repositioned when they arrived. Nothing happened right away. That was expected. Organizations don't react to facts the moment they appear. They react when those facts intersect with pressure, external scrutiny, operational failure, reputational risk. Until then, information just sits there, dormant, like a file no one opens because they assume it contains nothing urgent. So I kept moving in silence. I didn't withdraw my support. I didn't suddenly become guarded. If anything, I became even more consistent. I showed up on time. I answered questions thoroughly. I continued to help teams navigate technical details as issues slowly surfaced and were labeled irregularities rather than incidents. That distinction mattered, as long as nothing had a name, nothing had an owner. Behind the scenes, however, small shifts were already happening. I could feel them before I could see them. Meetings with slightly different attendee lists. Side conversations paused when I entered a room. Questions are framed more carefully than before. No one accused me of anything. No one even implied concern. But the tone had changed. I stayed out of interpretation mode. That was important. Assumptions create noise, and noise invites reaction. I stuck to observable facts. What was asked, what was documented, what was said aloud versus what was written down. When legal and compliance teams began quietly requesting historical context, nothing formal yet, just background, I provided exactly what was requested. No more, no less. Always in writing, always with references. I never volunteered conclusions. I didn't need to. The timeline spoke for itself. What surprised me was how long it took for anyone to connect the dots emotionally. Intellectually, they were starting to understand the scope. But emotionally, the organization was still operating as if this were a technical hiccup, something to be fixed, not examined. That worked in my favor, because by the time the mood shifted from fixing to assigning, the record was already set. I watched as responsibility began its familiar search for gravity. Questions like, where was this monitored and who owned oversight here, started appearing in draft documents and meeting agendas. I recognized the shape of that conversation, and still I said nothing beyond what I was asked. There's a discipline to that kind of restraint. A temptation to preempt, to defend yourself before anyone has even questioned you. But doing that too early can be misread as guilt, or worse, fear. I wasn't afraid. I was prepared. While others scrambled to reconstruct memory, I relied on sequence. While interpretations shifted week to week, my documentation stayed still. I didn't need to argue for my position. I just needed to occupy it. Moving in silence isn't about hiding. It's about not interrupting inevitability. And by then, inevitability was already in motion. The consequences didn't arrive with an announcement. They surfaced as absences. A decision that didn't get made. A meeting that was postponed and quietly cancelled. An approval that stalled without explanation. People began to feel resistance without knowing where it was coming from. At first, there was confusion. The systems team kept working. Patches were discussed, mitigations proposed. But there was a subtle drag now, as if the organization had entered a slower current. Compliance asked more questions. Legal asked for clarification. Not accusations, clarifications. The kind that forces people to revisit assumptions they'd been comfortable leaving vague. I noticed how often my name appeared in those conversations, not as a problem, but as a reference point. When was Victor looped in? What did Victor flag originally? Do we have Victor's assessment from earlier this year? Each question landed somewhere upstream of me. I wasn't in the room when they were asked. I didn't need to be. What mattered was that the answers already existed. I watched the shift ripple outward. Managers who had once spoken confidently now chose their words more carefully. Phrases like, "I believe," and "as far as I recall," started appearing in drafts, then disappearing after review. Memory was becoming unreliable. Facts were not. The pressure didn't manifest as panic yet. It showed up as discomfort, as meetings ran longer than scheduled, as documents that went through more revisions than usual, as people double-checked decisions they'd once treated as settled. And beneath it all, there was a growing awareness that this wasn't a sudden failure. It had a history. That realization is destabilizing. Because if something was foreseeable, then someone chose not to act. And if someone chose not to act, then responsibility isn't abstract anymore. I remained where I had always been. Available, composed, factual. No one accused me. No one thanked me either. But something important had changed. I was no longer the easiest place to land the weight. The organization began to feel the cost of delay. Not just technically, but narratively. The longer it took to respond, the harder it became to claim surprise. Every unanswered question made the timeline sharper. I could see it in how people avoided eye contact in meetings where my documentation was referenced. How often they deferred follow-ups with, "Let's confirm that." In how silence, once my burden, now made others uneasy. Consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like gravity reasserting itself. And for the first time, it wasn't pulling toward me. By the time panic arrived, it was already obsolete. That's the strange thing about organizational regret. It always shows up after the window where it could have mattered. When options still existed, there was confidence. When confidence was gone, so were the options. The tone changed first. Emails that used to be breezy became careful, almost stiff. Meetings gained agendas where there hadn't been any before. Words like alignment, due diligence, and shared accountability started appearing with unnatural frequency, like charms meant to ward something off. People wanted to fix the story. I could see the effort in real time. Draft summaries softened timelines. Language was rearranged to blur the sequence. Decisions that had once been definitive were reframed as collaborative. Risks that had been deferred were described as newly discovered. None of it was aggressive. None of it was dishonest in isolation. But taken together, it was an attempt to compress time, to make 6 months feel like 6 weeks. It didn't work, because systems remember what people try to forget. Every revision triggered another question. Every softened phrase invited a request for clarification. The more they tried to smooth the narrative, the more attention it drew to the underlying facts. That's when the questions changed. Not what happened, but when we know. That distinction terrifies organizations because it pulls intention into the frame. It forces a comparison between awareness and action, between warning and response. I was asked to join a meeting I hadn't been part of before. Not confrontational, not accusatory, just quiet. A few people from compliance, someone from legal, a neutral tone throughout. They didn't ask me to explain myself. They asked me to confirm the timeline. I did. I answered simply, referenced documents, pointed to dates, clarified wording where needed. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate about motives. I didn't express frustration. I let the record speak. That's when I felt it, the moment they realized it was too late to reposition me. Not because I'd fought them, but because there was nothing to argue with. You can't debate timestamps. You can't negotiate sequence. You can't soften an email that already exists in multiple systems, acknowledged and archived. After that meeting, the scramble intensified. Suddenly there were suggestions about process improvements, about shared responsibility models, about learning moments. All valid, all insufficient. The organization wanted closure without consequence, but closure requires containment. And this couldn't be contained anymore. I watched as people tried quietly to reassign ownership retroactively, to emphasize my involvement without emphasizing my lack of authority, to imply oversight without implying control. They were careful, and they were too late, because by then, the truth had already settled into place, not as an accusation, but as a structure no one could move without exposing themselves. Fixing the issue was possible. Fixing the story was not. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly calm. No raised voices, no dramatic reveals, no moment where someone slammed a hand on the table and demanded answers. It took place in a small conference room with neutral lighting and a carefully curated guest list. I remember noticing how everyone chose their seat. That's where my attention went. Not to the agenda, not to the prepared remarks. To proximity, to whom sat closest to whom. Those who avoided the center of the table. Power dynamics reveal themselves long before anyone speaks. The tone was respectful, almost gentle. Someone opened by thanking me for my thoroughness. Another acknowledged the complexity of the situation. There were phrases about shared goals, collective learning, and moving forward. Then carefully the question came, not an accusation, a framing. They asked whether I felt I had enough visibility and influence over the decisions that led to the incident. It was a subtle attempt to redistribute responsibility without assigning blame. To suggest that maybe the issue wasn't that warnings were ignored, but that oversight hadn't been strong enough. I understood the invitation. This was the moment where, if I accepted the premise, I would become part of the problem they needed me to be. So I answered plainly. I said I had visibility. I said I did not have authority. I said I had documented concerns when they arose and escalated them through the appropriate channels. I said the decisions that followed were not mine to make. I didn't say it defensively. I didn't say it emotionally. I said it like someone describing weather patterns. Then I stopped talking. Silence is uncomfortable when it's no longer yours. They shifted, clarified, rephrased the question, tried again, this time asking if there was anything I would have done differently. I said yes. I said I would have wanted clearer ownership of risk acceptance at the time. Formal acknowledgement, documented sign-off. I paused. Then I added that I had raised that need as well. Again, I referenced where no heat, no edge, just sequence. The room went still, not tense, but resigned. This wasn't a clash. It was a closing. They had hoped for something malleable, an interpretation, a shared ambiguity. What they got instead was structure. After that, the conversation shifted toward next steps. Process improvements, governance changes, training, all necessary, all overdue. No one asked me to take responsibility. No one asked me to apologize. The meeting ended the way it began, politely. As I walked out, I realized something important. Confrontation doesn't require force when the truth is already anchored. All it requires is the refusal to absorb what isn't yours. After everything settled, after the reviews, the documentation, the careful language and quiet recalibrations, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt lighter, not because I'd won anything, but because I was no longer carrying something that had never belonged to me. For a long time, my identity inside that system had been shaped by usefulness, by how well I could anticipate needs, absorb pressure, and make myself easy to work with. I mistook that for integrity. I thought being agreeable was the same as being ethical. Now I understand the difference. Integrity isn't about how much weight you can carry in silence. It's about knowing which weight is yours and setting the rest down without bitterness. I'm still calm, still measured, still someone who prefers clarity over confrontation. That didn't change. What changed was my relationship to responsibility. I no longer confuse proximity with ownership. I no longer assume that being involved means being accountable for decisions I don't control. I ask different questions now. Who owns this decision? Where is that ownership documented? What happens if the risk materializes? Not aggressively, not defensively, just early, just clearly. And if the answers aren't there, I don't fill the gap with goodwill anymore. I don't step into ambiguity to make others comfortable. I let the absence speak for itself. Some people interpreted that as distance. Others have confidence. A few probably saw it as a shift in loyalty. It wasn't. It was in alignment with myself. I also stopped needing recognition. Not because I don't value it, but because I no longer measure my worth by how invisible I can make my contribution. Being unseen is not the same as being strong. Quiet dominance doesn't come from endurance. It comes from self-definition. I didn't leave immediately. I didn't make dramatic changes. I simply occupied my role differently, with clearer boundaries, with documentation as default, not defense, with the understanding that systems don't protect people, people protect themselves within systems. And I did. There's no resentment when I look back, no desire to rewrite the past. The experience gave me something more durable than vindication. It gave me clarity about how organizations work, about how narratives form, about how easily responsibility drifts toward the quiet. Most importantly, it taught me that you don't have to raise your voice to change the outcome. Sometimes all you have to do is stop carrying what was never yours to begin with. There's a temptation when a story like this ends to look for villains, to assign faces to failure, to imagine intent where there may have only been habit, pressure, and convenience. But that's never felt honest to me. What happened wasn't the result of a single bad actor or a dramatic betrayal. It was the result of silence being misunderstood. For a long time, I believed that doing the right thing quietly was enough. That warning without insisting was still a warning. That documentation without authority would naturally protect the person who created it. What I learned instead is this: systems don't reward foresight unless it's paired with structure. If your role is to see risk, but not to decide, you have to be explicit about where your responsibility ends. Otherwise, it will expand to fill whatever space others leave behind. This isn't a lesson about becoming louder, harsher, or more confrontational. It's not about forcing control or demanding power you don't want. And then it's about precision, about making sure the truth exists somewhere solid, about understanding that calm doesn't have to mean compliant, that professionalism doesn't require self-erasure. Quiet dominance isn't about winning after the fact. It's about not losing yourself before the moment even arrives. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't rewrite history. I simply refused to let the story be told out of order. And in doing that, I protected something far more important than my reputation. I protected my integrity. If you take anything from this, let it be this: if you are the person who sees the cracks early, the one who notices patterns before they become problems, your voice matters. But so does the way it's recorded. So does where it lives when memory fades and narratives shift. You don't owe anyone your silence, and you don't have to raise your voice to be heard in the end. I'm curious, quietly, genuinely, have you ever been in a position where doing the right thing early went unnoticed, and only later did you realize how close you came to carrying the blame for something you tried to prevent? If so, I'd like to hear your story.